Well, thank you very much for having me. Frankly, John Locke Foundation staff for just tolerating me coming into the building every now and then. Appreciate that. This is a challenging topic, and it should be obvious to you why this is the case. When we decided originally to do a post-election discussion, we assumed that the midterm elections would be interesting. And the problem is, I'm afraid I'm going to run out of material in about 15 minutes, because there's just not a whole lot to say. So I will take any suggestions you have for other topics. I will tell you I can extemporaneously speak about the history of tap dancing. I can certainly talk about which superhero group I think I belong in. I've been speculating about that on social media recently. I don't think I can join the Avengers because I'm just not mean enough, and I don't have enough hair. I can't join the Justice League because it is now the Social Justice League, and it's really not something I fit into. I can't be a defender because I'm too offensive. I can't be an invader because I'm too defensive, and I can't be a member of the Doom Patrol because I'm too optimistic. I can't join the Incredibles because you have to be a member of the family, apparently, to join the Incredibles. And I can't join the Fantastic Four because that would make it 5. And it just doesn't, it could be like the feasible 5 or something like that. I just don't think it would work. So I'm willing to talk about any, when we run out of gas, I'll talk about any nerdy topic you wish. And I'm going to take my shot, at least, at making the 2018 midterm elections at least of moderate interest. Now, I'll also give you an apology right off the bat. 2 apologies. Number 1, I had a lot to do last week that had nothing to do with the election. Didn't get a lot of sleep. I'm a little punchy. And I did not prepare really, really elaborate, pretty slides. I did not have as I would normally do, a 35 to 40 slide show that I would simply narrate and I wouldn't have to do very much. Unfortunately, although I do have a few slides, we may actually have to have a conversation. Like I will talk to you, not showing my slides from my recent vacation or something, and then you can ask me questions and I will answer or dodge them as the case may be. This, by the way, is an artist rendering of an episode, an event in the Game of Thrones, which is the novel series that has become an HBO series. This is one of the few cases, by the way, where the TV show eventually is better than the book. But the reason I chose this is because it shows a lot of dead bodies and a lot of destruction, which seems like a good symbol. Also, the name of this event is the Battle of the Bastards, which strikes me as a useful description of lots of politics these days. So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to give you 4 C's, not like the 7 C's like we're sailing, but 4 C's. And they will be context, closeness, causes, and consequences. So first I'm going to try to put the election results as we have them at this moment, because there's still apparently people casting ballots. But I will try to summarize the situation as we know it at the moment, in context, put it in context, talk a little about just how closely divided our country, but specifically North Carolina is, how competitive our elections really are. Then I'm going to talk, at least theorize, about some of the causes of what happened in 2018, because no one really knows for sure, but there are some indicators that would suggest that we have at least some conception of the causes. And finally, the consequences, both legislative in North Carolina or judicial in North Carolina, but also political consequences as we move, as we already have, into the 2020 political season, which started about, 10:35 on Tuesday night, election night, when various Democrats began to post pictures of them with winning candidates, but not with losing ones, saying, hey, we did this, I did this. Remember that when the primaries start. All right. So this is a busy graph, but I figured it might be easy to just try to put everything together so we could get a sense of where we are. So as of 10:30 this morning, the Republicans look like they have gained 3 seats in the U.S. Senate. It's actually 2 because almost certainly Sinema will beat McSally in Arizona. And that's probably, by the way, a legitimate outcome. It's just when you have a lot of mailed-in ballots, it takes a long time to count them. So election night counts in places like California, Colorado, Arizona, Washington, Oregon. Be very careful about them because there's lots of ballots that are legitimate ballots from actual voters that just haven't been tallied yet when you get those election night results. But anyway, again, assuming Florida sticks, nothing weird happens in Mississippi in a few weeks, it looks like the Republicans will gain a net of 2 Senate seats. And that would put them, I guess, at 52-48-ish. The situation being that there are 2 Democrats two independents, really a communist and an independent, who caucus with the Democrats. On the House side, remember this plus 32 for the Ds or minus 32 for the Republicans is as of the moment. There are several, more than a half a dozen seats that are still outstanding. I went back and looked at some of those this morning, and I would guess, if I had to guess, I would say that the Democrats will have gained, in all told, 37 House seats. By the way, a little piece of trivia, the Gallup organization went back right before the election and looked at all the midterm elections for which they had polling. So we heard a lot about the average shift of seats in a midterm election, which is a useful number. It was in the 20s. But Gallup went back and said, okay, that's true, but that's for all the cycles. What if we just looked at cycles where the president has a higher disapproval rating than approval rating? What happens if the president is at least moderately unpopular in American midterms? And the answer is the president's party typically loses an average of 37 seats. Now, they did this before the elections. They had no idea that what we might do is hit that almost exactly, if not precisely, on the head at 37 seats. Governor's races, this may look a little odd to you. The Republicans lost 6 and the Democrats gained 7. Well, they haven't made, the District of Columbia a state or something like that. What actually happened is there was an independent, left-leaning governor in Alaska. The Republicans picked that seat up. So it wasn't a Democratic loss, but it was a Republican gain. So the net effect is the Republicans will have, we think, 26 or 27 seats in the governorships, and the Democrats will have 23. Now, if we look down the ballot a little bit, because that's what I'm, frankly, the most interested in, I'm looking for how the 2 parties are competing all the way down into the grassroots of the electorate. If we look at the partisan control of all the legislatures, and there are different numbers floating around about partisan control of legislatures, I'm using the calculations from Ballotpedia, which is a fantastic resource. If you're not using Ballotpedia to track elections, you ought to. They are of the body, as one might say if you understand Star Trek lore. They are in our wheelhouse, so to speak, but scrupulously fair and bipartisan in their approach, and they do a good count. And what they do that's different from others is that Nebraska has a kind of an odd duck situation. They have 1 chamber of the legislature, not 2, and they don't have party labels. But Ballotpedia counts it as a Republican chamber because it essentially is. Okay, so if you do that, then here's what you end up with. Pre-election, there were 67 Republican chambers out of 99. Not 100 because Nebraska's 1 chamber. Okay, 67, 2/3 were R, 1/3 were D. There's a net gain for the Democrats of 5 legislative chambers. That's actually quite a bit lower than the average change in a midterm election. So when it comes to legislative chambers, Democrats did not perform at average. They performed below average. Democrats would say, hey, there's more gerrymandering than there used to be, and so even if we post good results, we don't take as many chambers as the parties might have taken 10 or 20 years ago. There is some truth to that, but it's oversold. As I'm going to talk about in a little bit, there are other reasons why there are gaps between the votes that are tallied on election night and the district distribution. But it is certainly the case that Democrats gained some legislative chambers. They did it in Colorado, Maine. Both chambers in New Hampshire flipped. This happens a lot. New Hampshire flips more than any other state. Does anybody know why New Hampshire flips its legislature more than any other? No, you don't get to answer that. No Carolina Journal staff, but somebody else.
Every 2 years.
Yes, but so do we. I mean, there are states like New Hampshire, but also Vermont, also North Carolina, where all the seats are of every 2 years. That's not the difference. The difference is that like every other person in New Hampshire is a state legislator or something like that. There are 400 and something members in the House. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of seats. So your legislative district in New Hampshire is, frankly, you get about as many votes as if you're running on city council races in North Carolina. So if you have that many seats, hundreds and hundreds of seats, then forget drawing maps to favor your party, forget various kinds of geographic dispersal patterns. It's going to follow the wind. If the wind blows Democratic, going to flip dozens, maybe even more, maybe hundreds of seats in New Hampshire. And the wind flows the other way, next turnaround it goes back and forth. Some have argued that New Hampshire and Vermont, which has almost as many seats, that's a good model that America should follow, that our Congress should be much larger than its current size. If you were to take the original number of legitimate voters for U.S. House seats when the House was invented, and you were extrapolating that to today, and so you're going to, as the population grows, you add more House seats, there would be thousands of members of Congress. Now, on the one hand, that might sound like, you have a few locusts, you have a lot of locusts, you have a swarm. This could be a problem. But the flip side of that is that it would probably be a lot easier to run for Congress. There would be more competitive seats. You would have more of a chance of knowing your member of Congress, maybe seeing him or her and yelling at him or her at the appropriate time or whatever you want. So there's some arguments for it. I don't think it'll ever happen because lawmakers would have to voluntarily put an amendment on the ballot for the states that gives up power for the people who are in the incumbency, right? Because they would lose if there's only 13 members of the North Carolina delegation of the U.S. House, and under this scenario there would be dozens, they would be giving up influence, and so it seems unlikely they would do so. Anyway, that's the little thing about New Hampshire. I think that overall nationwide the number of legislative seats that will go from the net number from R to D will be about 330. That's a lot of races, but keep in mind that in President Obama's first midterm, when he took it on the chin, it was 2.5 times that number. So it's a pretty good swing, but it's not a historic swing at the legislative level for the Democrats. If we look over here at trifectas are places where one party or the other controls both chambers of the legislature and the governor. Going into 2018, there were 8 Democratic trifectas, which is basically California and some, the 7 dwarfs and the Republicans had a majority, and then there were all these divided governments. Now it's a little closer together. Republicans have 22 trifectas, the Democrats have 14. We'll see how that develops off into the future. We still have some divided governments, and of course they're calling Georgia as uncalled, but it's really going to be a Republican governor unless something really bizarre happens. So the number of trifectas will go to 23 for the Republicans. Now stick with me on this side for a second. I just want to show you, because Ballotpedia is so neato, they even take consideration of lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state. These are places where the Republicans were, except for a few places, largely irrelevant until fairly recently in our modern politics. And now they have become much more relevant. After the 2018 elections, it looks like the Republicans will still have a majority of the nation's lieutenant governorships. The two parties will be almost tied, 24 Democrat and 22 Republican attorneys general, plus some unsettled races in a few places that don't have elected attorneys general. Secretaries of state, Republicans have a majority. This is an area where the national media gets really confused because their impression of secretaries of state is Florida. They can't get past 2,000 or maybe like yesterday afternoon. So they think the primary purpose of secretaries of state is to run elections, which is true in some places. Is it true in North Carolina? No. So secretaries of state differ. None of them involve foreign embassies. But they have other kinds of roles, regulatory roles, administrative roles in various states. Not as interested in that number. But in terms of lieutenant governor, attorney general, and some other kinds of down-ballot statewide races, the Republicans lost some ground in 2018, but it was not a face crush. So how does all this add up into the pivotal question that you all have in your top of your foreheads? Was this a blue wave election or not? Well, the simple answer to the question is, does it really matter? I mean, it's a semantic distinction. It was a Democratic year for the most part. But I think it is fair to say it was not a wave election. If we're just going to count every time that one party does better than the other party as a wave election, we're going to be waving a lot. Okay, basically every year we'll have a wave. That's a silly way to do it. How should you do it? First of all, you should decide what would define a wave election before the election happens. I know that's a radical notion, but you should put out a marker. I think that if they reach these markers, it's a wave, otherwise it is not. Well, our friends at Ballotpedia did such a thing. They went back, I think, all the way through the 20th century, all the way to the beginning, ran a model of all the midterm election results, and they created a curve, and basically they divided the outcomes into quintiles, okay, 20%. And they counted a wave election as if it gets into the top quintile. So if it's anywhere else, it's just sort of wandering back and forth around the mean. But if it's way out here on one side for the D's or the R's, that's a wave election. If you follow that methodology, it would have required Democrats to gain 48 seats in the House to be a blue wave. It would have required a gain of 7 seats in the Senate, not a loss. That's the biggest problem with the wave theory. It would have required a net of 7 governorships, which actually they met. And it would require almost 500 swing in the legislative seats, which they did not reach. So the fairest way to describe this is it is not a wave election. You can tell by the fact that the Senate and the House went in different directions, which pretty much precludes the idea of it being a wave. But also just the gains by the Democrats were very good, but they were not exemplary. It does not constitute a wave election. Now in North Carolina, one might argue it was a stronger Democratic year than it was on average for the rest of the country. So while there were no gains in the U.S. House delegation for the Democrats, which they have various explanations for, but there was a gain of legislative seats. As we know, assuming the current trends continue, 10 seats in the House net went to the Democrats and 6 in the state Senate, enough to break the supermajorities, but not the majorities, in those 2 chambers. The average loss of the president's party of legislative seats in a midterm election is 11 since 1970. I don't take my statistics earlier than 1970 because, frankly, it's silly. If you go if you go into the 60s and 50s, it's not really 2-party competition, and you really can't draw reasonable conclusions. So 1970 is the first place to start for these kind of data. But now if you just set aside who's in the White House and which party it favors and just look at the total number of seats that change hands from year to year, the average since 1970 is 15. So we're almost close to the average, a little better than the average for the Democrats. Court cases, court seats, Democrats won all of the statewide competitive races, the state Supreme Court race, of course, and the 3 appeals court races. The argument was made, and I made it, before the election that the Republicans had messed themselves up here by getting rid of judicial primaries, which allowed Chris Anglin, a Republican, to file and split the Republican vote. Though actually, the way it turned out on Election Day, if you look at the numbers, unless you assume that every single vote for Anglin would have gone to Barbara Jackson, which is an unreasonable assumption, it seems likely that Anita Earls would have won anyway. So I hate to break this to you, but that particular story, which I was telling, didn't ultimately end up being an explanation for the outcome, whatever you think of the skullduggery involved. And probably the same is true for the Court of Appeals races where there were more than 2 candidates. Probably didn't make the difference either, but we'll see. All right, so some years ago, I created a North Carolina election index. It was not a unique idea. I borrowed it from some national people and made some modifications. And what I do here is I take the vote for president in the most recent presidential election, and then I use, is there a Republican or Democratic governor? How many of the other council state seats are held by one party or the other? What percentage of the Supreme Court is held by one side or the other? What percentage of state House seats? What percentage of state Senate seats? What percentage of the U.S. House delegation? How many of the 2 senators are controlled by one or the other party? and the share of county commissions controlled by one party or the other. I create an index value, and I've tracked this since actually 1950 because I wanted to show how Republicans started to matter. So during this whole period from 1950 to 1970, you notice I didn't choose 1970 arbitrarily, Republicans mattered. If you were in Wilkes County, right, Rick? Or Lincoln County or a few other places, they mattered, not much outside of that. There was a little bit of a jump here, and just to tell you a quick story, there was one Republican in the U.S. House delegation, Charlie Jonas. He represented a district that included Mecklenburg and Lincoln County and some other places, eventually Wilkes County actually. Well, the Democrats decided to gerrymander. I know this will shock you. But it turns out that even before the Republicans, the Democrats knew how to gerrymander, or at least they thought they did. So after the 1960 election, they decided, that Charlie Jonas, we're going to get rid of him. So they redrew the map, and they took away Republican-leaning places, Republican-leaning counties, because at this time they were all based on counties, took away the Republican counties and gave them to a next-door district that was controlled by a Democrat. But Charlie Jonas won anyway, and the next-door district flipped to Jim Broyhill, who won because the Democrats gerrymandered the map, but they forgot that when you gerrymander a map, the reason I'm bringing this up, remember this, put this as a little bookmark. When you draw a map to favor your side, it favors your side up to a certain point. But when you get beyond that point, it really hurts your side because now you've got a bunch of seats where the Republicans, let's say, would have won by 2 points. But the Democrats have a particularly good year. It flips all the seats over. Remember that. Democrats have done it too. Everybody's done it. 72, Helms is elected to the U.S. Senate. Jim Holzhauser elected to the governorship. Gains in legislature. Nixon, Republicans win the presidency, of course, in North Carolina. Then, woo, Watergate, woo! Okay. The 40 seats in the House, 40 seats in the General Assembly went from R to D in the Watergate blowout of 74. That's the biggest wave election in North Carolina political history at the legislative level. But then the Republicans started to grow back. Here's Reagan elected. Here's Reagan re-elected. Helms elected over Jim Hunt. Jim Martin elected governor. Bunch of legislative gains. Then there's some falling off again. Here's Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton's always associated with a downward trajectory of something. Hello, how you doing? Then there's a recovery in 1994. And you can see that, of course, this is 2012 when McCrory was elected governor. Republicans are now a majority for the first time in this index. So most of the political power, one could say, was with the Republicans after 2012. After 14, it got even higher. What happened there? Tom Tillis. Then in 2016, it falls back down to 58. And this year, I think it's going to be around 56. Now, these numbers are kind of notional. But I do think this more or less captures the ebb and flow of relative political power. Now, the difficulty of comparing this year in North Carolina to past years is it's a blue moon election, which means we're all standing alone without a dream in our heart. But it also means that we didn't have a Senate or governor's race. Now, we could go in and look at legislative counts and this and that. The problem is that from year to year, districts have changed, and also sometimes a member is challenged and sometimes the member is not challenged, and that'll throw off your popular vote comparisons. I decided to zero in on 2 Court of Appeals races for 2 reasons. Number one, Richard Dietz, who won the Court of Appeals, this particular race 2 years ago, and Andrew Heath, who very narrowly lost, are both friends of mine. They're both alumni of our leadership program. I always like to talk about our alumni. But also, I think they are fair comparisons. There are a variety of ways in which these races are kind of similar, except there were different years and different patterns. And you will see, by the way, if I'd had time, I would have prettified the map up and made this red and blue too. I don't know why the Board of Elections went with orange and tan or whatever that is, but I don't know. But anyway, what I indicate here is this is the 18 result where Arrowwood narrowly defeated Drew. This is the 16 result where Richard Dietz won. And I'm noting in these cases the counties that flipped. There weren't very many. Okay, so Watauga, Who knows this one? Jackson. I'm giving you a little geography lesson. Who knows this one? Granville County, Nash County, New Hanover County. These are all counties that went for the Republican 2 years ago, went for the Democrat this year. But one county, Bladen, went the other direction. And you can see that the results, this was not a blowout, but certainly Dietz won fairly comfortably, and this was a narrow loss by Drew. Now, this tells us some things. It tells us perhaps that overall there was a shift of some number of points from the Republican, from the Republican to the Democratic column in North Carolina. I think it's a reasonable way to think about it. Not a gigantic shift, but enough. But of course, we don't have an electoral college of counties, and we don't elect people by county, so this is a little odd to think about it in terms of counties. So let me just look just at Wake County so we can try to track some things happening. It's the same court race in Wake County, and you can see that if you go from here to here, how big a shift that is in Wake County of votes. It was a substantial shift in favor of the Democrats in Wake County. I think this is actually a more useful way to track what happened in Wake than looking at legislative races for the reasons I mentioned earlier. There's some comparability problems. And there's no pesky libertarians to mess up the math, by the way. Same is true in Mecklenburg. Yeah.
Well, John, but Vince Rozier didn't have his party label next to his name in 2016.
Yes, he did. Yeah. Court of Appeals, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. The Court of Appeals races were partisan. The North Carolina Supreme Court was nonpartisan. One of the many errors that was made about that race. But anyway. So yeah, it did have the party label. If we look at Mecklenburg, we see something similar. Look at the shift from Rozier. Now, of course, these are both places where the Democrats won, so you're just looking at the overall shift. And you can see a pretty sizable shift to the Democratic column in Mecklenburg County. These are our two most populous counties. They are the places where, if current trends continue, there are no North Carolina House seats held by Republicans after this election. 0. They got, in both cases, almost a third of the vote in Wake County, but no seats. Remember what I said earlier about 1962? This is the flip side of that. Republicans drew some maps. Now, there's some other things happening, too. But basically, you get to a certain point, they all tip over. They all tip over, and that's what happened. Yeah.
Have they decided about Brawley?
They haven't decided, but I would be surprised if it flipped back to Brawley's side. Rachel Hunt's currently in the lead. And the ballots that are probably going to come in, we'll see. Maybe it'll flip the other way, but right now it doesn't look good. She will have won by just a few dozen votes. There is a sitting state senator Republican in Mecklenburg, Dan Bishop, and John Alexander here in Wake County. And that is the entire urban county delegation of Republicans in the legislature at the moment. Now, the problem with this, though, again, is that Mecklenburg and Wake are urban counties that always vote Democratic, and people get a little carried away when they talk about urban and suburban and rural, and they're not thinking as closely as I think they should about what we're really talking about. So I like to make a distinction between inner suburbs, places like Cary or places where I live just outside of Cary, and outer suburbs on the fringes of the urban counties or into the neighboring counties. There are lots of Republicans that represent and lots of Republican voters in those suburban areas, and particularly in the outer suburbs. It doesn't take that many points to shift a seat from one side to the other. So I decided to look at something else, the region. So this is Mecklenburg, so pardon me if you're not as familiar with the geography, but it's a cleaner example. Here's Mecklenburg County, and here's all the counties that are next to it or almost. I mean, this is Catawba. It doesn't take long to get to Catawba. This is Rowan. It doesn't take long to get to Rowan. This is Stanley. It doesn't take long. So if we just take these counties as a clump, this is like the Charlotte area. Notice what happens when you do that. Dietz won 56% of the vote, and Drew won 50% of the vote. In other words, in general, this is actually still a slightly Republican area, if you're not just looking at Mecklenburg County. But again, there was a shift of something like that 5-6 point-ish shift in favor of Democrats. So, before we talk about that, closeness. This is super close. The McCrory loss to Roy Cooper was 0.2 of a percentage point. The closest gubernatorial election in American history until 2018, when it is possible that Florida will be closer. We'll see. But certainly one of the closest in American history, very, very close. I anticipate North Carolina being close for years to come. Now, one of the implications of that, as I've already referred to, is redistricting questions. I am a strong proponent of redistricting reform. I believed it when the Democrats were in charge. I believe it when the Republicans are in charge, because I try to be consistent, even if I'm consistently wrong. And I do believe, by the way, that there will be a strong push for redistricting reform in 2019. I think Republicans will be more amenable to it than they were in the past for two reasons. One, suddenly you're not so sure you'll be in charge in 2021 when the maps get drawn. But frankly, more importantly, the state Supreme Court is now a 5-2 Democratic court. Now, I mean no disrespect to our latest Associate Justice. But I'm here to tell you, if the Republicans get the sense that, as happened in Pennsylvania, there will be a state constitutional case filed, and it will get up to the Supreme Court, and Anita Earls will draw the maps, that starts to change the political calculation a bit about what to do. Now, having said all that, even though that situation is what it is, and perhaps let's say it changes, it is still the case that there will be a difference between the number of votes cast across a county or across a state, across the nation, and the number of seats that one or the other party holds. And that's because voters don't behave themselves. They simply don't. They don't equally divide themselves across the landscape. You know, you're deciding whether to move to a community, and you take a quick census of how many Democrats and Republicans, and if you're a Republican and there are already too many Republicans, you move somewhere else. That's not how it works. In fact, it probably works the other way, right? Oh, good, people that I like, I'll go move in that neighborhood. So the big sort that has happened means that in true urban cores, places that used to be somewhat competitive, remember when we had a Raleigh mayor who was a Republican? It wasn't that long ago. It was not even that long ago there was such a thing in Charlotte, in Greensboro, in Winston-Salem, in Durham, of all places. There used to be a Republican mayor, not anymore. And that's because of a sorting process where people who used to live, let's say, in North Raleigh and voted Republican, some of them now live in Franklin County. They still vote Republican, they vote Republican in Franklin County. Or their analog. The next wave of immigrants from New Jersey, instead of living in Cary, they live in Harnett County. Okay. So there's a big sort, and so even if you had districts that were not skewed one way or the other, I don't think you would end up with these closely matching vote versus district. And that's something that is often alleged in redistricting debates, and it is simply mistaken. Some call it stupid. I prefer not to use that term. I'd say they're mistaken. Stupidly mistaken. Okay. All right, so let's go to causes. What are the causes of this event in 2018? These are exit polls. It's all we got at the moment. I'd like to see some better polling that comes out later. But here's a couple of things I just want to point out. This was the year in which women turned against the Republicans. No, that's too narrow a storyline. If you look at the national exit poll, here's the gender question 16 and 18. Yes, the women in this scenario moved about 4 to 5 percentage points away from the Republicans, but so did the men. It was essentially the same shift. Remember, we're interested in the shift, not the absolute value. Democrats had gotten the Democratic vote, the female vote in 2016. They just got it bigger. But the same happened on the other side. How about race? Well, there's more of a story to tell here, and it has to do with basically all the groups shifting a little bit more Democratic. But you'll note the shift, which matters in some places among Asians, but the main story is right here. College graduates. Notice that there was a shift, but more importantly, look, in 16 it was about equally divided. In 18, the non-college graduates was a much larger number. So even though the Democrats did much better with college graduates, you'll see the number, they did much better with college graduates than before, but there were fewer of them in the electorate, which is maybe one reason why the Democrats didn't get all the way to a wave. The composition of the electorate was different than it was in a presidential year. Then if you look at age, you'll see something similar. It isn't just the shift, though you can see the shifts, but you can also see the Democrats had trouble getting these younger voters to turn out as they did in 2016, which is one reason why the Democratic wave didn't quite get there. It was a Democratic year, but it wasn't as big as it could have been because of the differences in age distribution. Married versus single. Actually, the same percentage here, definitely a shift among married of a sizable amount. Just a reality, assuming these polls are useful. Finally, as I said in my column today, don't get carried away thinking this is just about the suburbs. There was a shift in suburban, urban, and rural areas towards the Democrats. It just matters more in the suburbs because they're competitive. So if you lose if Republicans lose ground in downtown Raleigh, does that mean that all those representatives they used to have in Raleigh no? It doesn't really hurt them because they weren't going to win anyway. And similarly, if they win the rural areas a little bit less, they still win them. What happens is the shifts, even if they're across the board, they're going to flip you in these suburban districts. So, let's talk now about consequences and then take your questions. What are the consequences of these events? Well, let's talk legislative and judicial and then political. So in 2019, there will be a majority legislature, a Republican majority legislature and a Democratic governor, unlike before when it was a supermajority. And that means that when Roy Cooper vetoes the budget bill, the Republicans will not automatically be able to override it. This may also apply to other bills, but I guarantee you it will likely apply to the budget bill. So it will really be incumbent upon Republicans to game out what they want to do. And my suspicion is they will do one of two different kinds of strategies. One of them is find some areas of agreement. They may work on some more work on judicial reinvestment or criminal justice issues. They may work on some education stuff that's not related to school choice or something that the Democrats won't go along with. So they may work on some things where they can cooperate. I think both sides want to be able to say to themselves and to their voters, we can get things done. I think that will happen. But I also think that Republicans will want to have some votes on some matters that they think having the Democrats on record will hurt them in 2020. This will probably include the budget bill. If the governor vetoes it because it doesn't have a tax increase, the Republicans will say that this proves that they wanted higher taxes. There may even be situations where Democrats surprisingly find their bills moving through the legislature, and they might want to slow them down because what the Republicans want to do is get them out on the floor, get them voted on, defeat them, and have everybody on record. So those are some strategic calculations. I think people have gotten a little carried away thinking this is going to radically change what's happening in Raleigh. I think it significantly but not radically changes what happens in Raleigh. Having the legislature is still the more important story. It's more important than being in the governor's mansion in our state. In our state. Now in terms of judicial effects, judicial consequences, and those of you who are conservatives or Republicans, I just want you to just don't shoot the messenger. But the appeals court and certainly the Supreme Court has moved to the left. That means that any policies that you like as a conservative are in danger of being struck down, but there's no real reason. They're in danger of being struck down based upon whatever citation the majority wants to make. This is not just new things you want to do. These are old things you already did that you thought were already upheld by the Supreme Court. But they won't overturn precedent. Yeah, I don't believe you should nurse any such fantasies. So in the judicial situation, you want to get in federal court if you're a Republican or a conservative, which wasn't the case until recently, but now it is very much the case. It also means that, as I said earlier, that gerrymandering is a different storyline. All you have to do, again, is look at Pennsylvania to think through how that might work out. The same provisions, the Pennsylvania, very general, non-specific provisions in the Pennsylvania Constitution are also in our Constitution. So we'll see what happens. Finally, political. This does not tell you very much about 2020. I'm just here to tell you. Partly because I got 2016 so wrong that I am gun shy. I had a pretty good record of predicting races until 2016, and then they went kablooey. That's a technical term, by the way, Blake. don't know if you learned that in political science class. Kablooey is a particular, it's like the quintile. Okay. And so what I'm saying about that is, well, let's look at the Michigan Senate race or the Michigan governor's race or the Pennsylvania House races and decide which way they're going to go for Trump. This is a fool's errand, folks. That is the wrong way to do it. This is up for grabs. We don't know who the candidates are going to be. In 2016, in my opinion, certainly after the fact, it was all about the particular matchup. I think if President Trump had been against anybody other than a Clinton, he might have lost. I think that if Clinton had been against, a variety of other Republicans, she would have lost larger. So it has to do with the matchup. It has to do with the specific individuals in a race. And I am not assuming that Trump will be the nominee. I think if he runs, he'll be the nominee, but I'm not quite so sure he'll run. But if he runs, I'm not so sure he couldn't win again. He might be able to pull off something like the same kind of flip of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio. Might still happen. But it may also prove to be kind of a fluke that couldn't. I just think it's uncertain. So I'm going to focus on North Carolina. I think that Governor Cooper is in good shape, but he's not in great shape. He's in good shape because his disapproval ratings are low. People don't really have a strong opinion about him, but if they have an opinion about him, it's mildly positive or maybe strongly positive. And that's a good sign for him. But as we have seen, our races in North Carolina are pretty darn competitive. He only won, as I said, by plurality of 0.2 of a point. And if Dan Forrest, for example, or some other Republican runs an effective campaign in a year, the dynamics of which we really don't know yet, Cooper could be in trouble. The Supreme Court can't flip can't flip for a while. But the governor's race is up for grabs. And yes, under the current maps, actually the current maps won't stick. Under the maps that will be in place in 2020, Democrats can make gains in Congress or none. The Republicans have a fairly good shot of taking back some seats in Wake and Mecklenburg and places like that they lost if it's a different electorate, different year. But it is also theoretically possible you'd end up after the 2020 elections with 62 or 63 Democrats in the House, 26, 27 Democrats in the Senate, which again I'll return to make my final point. If you're comfortable with that as a Republican and you want them to draw the maps, then by all means don't reform the system. But I'm not sure I would make that bet. All right, we have a few minutes for questions. I'll be, as I said, be happy to answer them or pretend I can't hear them. But in Fred's case, I'll definitely answer.
What do you make of the North Carolina delegation to the U.S. House? It seemed like a pretty good outcome.
Yeah, I mean, the Democrats did not win the 9th, the 13th, or the 2nd. They were hoping to win at least one. Some were speculating they could win all three. They didn't get there. In fact, in the 13th, they weren't really close. The 2nd, they weren't all that close. It was really just the 9th that ended up being very competitive, as one should have predicted all along, in my opinion. That's a great outcome for Republicans given the baseline. I wouldn't take a whole lot of comfort from it. A few changes here or there, and they could have lost one, maybe even two of those seats. Those seats are, and aren't we going to redraw those again? Right? Isn't there a case where they didn't have time to draw the congressional map again? So we're going to have new districts in 2020. I don't know. Marilyn.
Are we going to do an in-depth analysis of who voted this time? The reason I ask is our son is still registered at our address. He's been gone for years. He's 38. He's registered as an unaffiliated, and he hasn't voted except year 2000.
Yep.
He received a stack of mail like you would not believe, both from my opponent, Matt Call, and Linda Coleman.
Mm-hmm.
And one Republican, John Alexander.
You didn't send mail to your own? Oh.
I know where but I'm wondering how many of that type, because I know there was a micro-targeting issue because the mail that was sent against me to my son, guess what the subject matter was?
What?
Fracking.
Fracking?
Fracking. 2 mailers on fracking. So they were hitting emotions with people. It didn't have anything to do with what was currently at issue. They were reaching out to people to hit that emotion. That's why
I mean, maybe that was Maybe that was a good. That strikes me as a waste of money. Why in the world do they send you mailers about fracking? That's just silly. Oh, I understand, but I don't think it was because of fracking.
Just because of the fact that they looked at him,
Yeah,
would he get mad about fracking?
yeah,
It'd be something that would ring a bell with him and he'd go vote.
yeah.
How many of those kind of votes?
I mean, both sides have, as y'all know, probably know, they have increasingly sophisticated databases of voters. They know a whole lot about all the voters they're trying to reach. And I've seen from both parties, they're not supposed to show it to me, but I have seen reports from both voter files. They're very interesting. There is still some speculation involved. Some of it is polling rather than what magazine subscription you've got, which I guess could be out of date, but is somewhat of an indicator. I haven't seen a more sophisticated examination of exactly who voted. But that's the system that we're going to have. This is why mail has become sort of the old news that's good, that's new news, because you can, with these voter files, you can target a message to somebody in a piece of mail that is highly, highly efficient expenditure versus running ads that talk to all sorts of people who can't vote for you. I think that's the future, and it's not going to all go, at least in the foreseeable future, I don't believe it's all going to go on the internet, because there's a difference between getting an email among many, many, many emails and getting a piece of mail in a mailbox when you don't get as much as you used to. Now it kind of sticks out. I mean, at my house, we enjoyed getting all the mailers. We'd take, there'd be stacks of mailers, and we would laugh at them, and because we're unaffiliated, so we got a lot of interesting mail. Most of it was aimed at my wife, though. They all said her name instead of mine. Yes?
Any comment on the constitutional amendments?
On the constitutional amendments, 4 passed, 2 failed. The 2 failed are the ones that were the lengthiest and most convoluted on the ballot for people who weren't familiar with it. Plus, there was bipartisan opposition to those 2 and not to the other 4. This isn't just a case of Democrats turned out, Republicans didn't. Democrats, no, because it's not what happened. I mean, some of those amendments passed easily, even though the Democrats hated them. And then the 2 that the Democrats fought the most against failed, but some Republicans were against them too, on balance of power grounds or just sort of monkey business grounds. So I think that this is actually a case where the voters either gave up when they got to the convoluted things, which, by the way, is not a horrible heuristic to use. If it's on the ballot and it's really, really complicated, there's some reason why you might be suspicious of something that's really complicated. But anyway, they came out exactly as most people predicted. That's why I didn't spend as much time talking about them. They really weren't surprising, in my view. The Nix all 6 thing was always a foolish expenditure, in my opinion. Always foolish. Yes?
Yeah, my main concern in 2020 is Tom Tillis. Any thoughts?
Well, do you know something I don't know? Is he going to run?
I assume.
I don't know. I honestly don't know.
He sent me a fundraising letter the other day.
Oh, that doesn't mean anything. Who's going to run against Tom Tillis? Who's the Democratic candidate, do you think? I think Jeff Jackson, Chris Anglin. You mean in the primary? After all, he's a Republican. I think Josh Stein and Jeff Jackson are both possible candidates. Yeah.
John, there seems to be a flow as the population grows. It's harder for Republicans to win. Now we know Mecklenburg and Wake, but even the other areas, we love to supermajority, but over time, as other areas grow, will it be even hard? Will Republicans lose more seats? There seems to be a fondness for liberalism when populations get higher.
Well, that's interesting. It's not so much about population, but population density. I wrote a book about this many years ago where I argued that over the course of American history, you can understand political changes according in part to residential patterns. As people start to live next to each other, they live in clumps, they live in cities, they tend to be more oriented, they become more, some big institution does things for me, they sell me water instead of me having a well, Maybe I'm all wet on that analogy, but I do think there's something to that. But keep in mind that in North Carolina, until about 15 years ago, the storyline where all these people are moving in from Connecticut and Ohio, okay, that was a Republican story. That's the reason the Republicans mattered. It wasn't just conservative Democrats flipping, that wasn't enough to get them there. It was also all these people who were Republicans, because everybody was Republican in my hometown in Massachusetts. Okay? So until, again, about 10, 15 years ago, that influx of voters was generally speaking on balance positive for Republicans. They didn't all move to downtown Charlotte or down. By the way, I'm from Charlotte, so I can say downtown Charlotte instead of uptown Charlotte. But they didn't move downtown. They moved to Cary. They moved to North Raleigh. They moved to southeast Charlotte. Okay. Well, now they're still coming here. They're more Democratic than they used to be, but the ones who are Republican are still coming here. It's just they moved directly into Union County. They moved directly into Johnston County. And so there's still a lot of Republican voters in fast-growing areas. They're just not in the urban cores. That's the point I was making about the Charlotte area. Charlotte area is still a moderately Republican place, not a Democratic place. It's just that Mecklenburg County isn't competitive for Republicans like it used to be. But some of these vote totals in places like Union County, they're like 3-to-1, 4-to-1 Republican. Cabarrus actually is a little bit different. Cabarrus was more mixed, which was a trouble sign for the Republicans. Yeah.
On the U.S. House side, the Republicans had a lot of retirements. It was like 40
Yeah.
retirements.
Yeah.
And at first, it was sort of the rat's leaving a sinking ship. They kind of thought they were going to get slaughtered.
Mm-hmm.
If they had had those retirements, do you think the House would have flipped?
Yes. It might have been a somewhat lower term. Incumbents have an easier time than an open seat of holding a seat for the party. But I think a lot of those retirements were ahead of being defeated. Or not being defeated, but I don't want to be in the minority, and we're going to be in the minority, and so you leave. So I think it would have been lost, but maybe by a smaller margin if you hadn't had all the retirements. But again, when Republicans do well, and there was a real Republican wave in '94 and a real Republican wave in 2010, both of those were preceded by Democratic retirements, significant Democratic retirements. It is part of the cycle. Yeah. One more?
Oh, did you call me?
Yes, I did, Laurie.
Particularly in eastern North Carolina, there were some races. I'm thinking of Senator Danny Britt and areas like that,
Right.
where the Democratic vote was, way outnumbered the Republican vote, but he still won by a huge
He did.
margin. And do you think that's more that we still have a lot of, blue dog Democrats, or is it the strength of some of the candidates?
You mean yellow dog Democrat?
I actually almost said yellow dog, but,
Um,
or just, I know he was a particularly strong candidate. He was everywhere.
Yeah, another example of phenomenon. Bob Steinberg in the Outer Banks base, Northeast base, State Senate District. On paper, in theory, that should be competitive. In practice, Republicans are going to do pretty well there because there really are still conservative Democrats in that area that will vote for Republicans down the ballot, just like with Britt's race, or ticket splitters who actually will pick here, pick there. We don't have very many ticket splitters like we used to. Ticket splitters are now typically 5 to 10 percentage points. They used to be 20 or 25%. At least in places like the southern states, the ticket splitting phenomenon has shrunk. Who we were talking about earlier before, there's still some in Massachusetts. Large numbers of people voted for Elizabeth Warren and the Republican governor, who, by the way, used to help run the conservative think tank in Massachusetts, the Pioneer Institute. So it isn't just like a liberal Republican or something. There are still ticket splitters, not as many in our state. So here's what I want to do to conclude. I tried as hard as I could not to make any real predictions. But if I made any, and you wrote them down, please tear them into little pieces and swallow them. All recordings will be erased. Thank you very much.